Right now, you probably own more pairs of shoes than you could easily count off the top of your head. Running shoes, boots, sandals, dress shoes, each designed for a specific purpose, each something you likely put on without thinking twice. But there was a very real point in human history when nobody had shoes at all. No leather soles, no protective covering of any kind, just bare feet against rock, ice, thorns, and scorching sand. So how did early humans actually go from walking around completely barefoot to inventing one of the most fundamental universal pieces of human technology still in daily use today? Let's dig into this properly, because the answer involves some clever archaeological detective work, a surprising amount of uncertainty, and a remarkably interesting story about how necessity, geography, and human ingenuity gradually came together. Let's start with the most basic question worth addressing first. Why would early humans have needed shoes at all beyond simple comfort? The honest answer is survival, in a fairly direct and practical sense. Feet, unlike most other parts of the body, are in constant direct contact with the ground during virtually every waking hour, exposed continuously to sharp rocks, thorns, extreme temperatures, and rough or uneven terrain. In a world without modern medical care, even a relatively minor foot injury, a deep cut, a serious puncture wound, frostbite, could become a life-threatening problem, either through infection or through the simple inability to continue traveling, hunting, or fleeing danger while healing. Foot protection, in this sense, wasn't a luxury or a comfort item. It represented a genuine, practical survival necessity, particularly as early humans began migrating into increasingly varied and challenging environments. Let's talk about how researchers actually figured out when footwear first appeared, because this represents one of the more clever pieces of archaeological detective work in this entire field. Given that the earliest footwear was almost certainly made from organic materials, leather, plant fiber, or woven grass that simply don't survive intact across tens of thousands of years the way stone tools or bone fragments often do. Since actual preserved shoes from the very earliest periods of human footwear use essentially don't exist, researchers have had to develop clever, indirect methods for estimating when this technology likely first emerged. One of the most compelling of these methods involves examining changes in toe bone structure and shape in ancient skeletal remains. Researchers studying human foot bones have found that populations regularly wearing supportive footwear tend to show measurably different patterns of toe bone development compared to populations that went barefoot consistently throughout their lives, since consistent barefoot walking on natural terrain places different mechanical stresses on the foot compared to walking in some form of supportive covering. By examining these subtle differences in ancient skeletal remains, researchers have been able to estimate that regular footwear use likely became established sometime within the last 40,000 years or so, though this estimate remains subject to ongoing debate and refinement as additional skeletal evidence gets discovered and analyzed using increasingly sophisticated techniques. This detail is honestly one of the more fascinating aspects of the whole topic, because it means researchers are essentially reading the history of footwear not from the shoes themselves, which no longer exist, but from the subtle physical marks that wearing those shoes left behind on the human body over enough repeated use and enough successive generations. It's a remarkably clever piece of scientific inference, working backward from physical evidence on the body itself to reconstruct a technology that left no other direct physical trace behind. Let's talk about the earliest likely forms footwear actually took, because it almost certainly didn't start with anything resembling a modern, structured shoe. The earliest footwear was likely extremely simple, probably little more than pieces of animal hide or thick plant material wrapped and tied around the foot for basic protection against sharp or hot terrain, without any of the more sophisticated construction techniques, proper soles, secure fastening systems, shaped fit that would develop later. This kind of simple, wrapped foot covering would have required minimal specialized tool use or technical skill, making it a plausible, accessible technology even for very early human populations without particularly advanced tool-making capability, evolving gradually over time into more sophisticated, purpose-built designs as human technical skill and available tools continued to advance. Let's talk about specific archaeological evidence that has actually survived despite the general fragility of early footwear materials, because there are some seriously remarkable exceptions worth discussing directly. In certain very specific environmental conditions, extremely dry caves, or environments with consistently low oxygen and moisture that slow decomposition dramatically, organic materials, including early footwear, have occasionally survived in remarkably good condition, offering researchers rare, direct physical evidence rather than purely indirect inference from skeletal remains. Sandals made from woven plant fiber, discovered in dry cave environments in various parts of the world, have been dated to several thousand years old in some cases, providing valuable direct confirmation information of specific footwear construction techniques used by these particular ancient populations, though these specific surviving examples are considerably younger than the more indirect skeletal evidence, suggesting footwear use began considerably earlier than these specific surviving physical examples can directly confirm on their own. This distinction is worth appreciating because it highlights an important, recurring pattern in archaeology more broadly. The earliest, most groundbreaking use of a particular technology often leaves behind the least direct physical evidence, precisely because the materials involved were simple, organic, and highly perishable. It's only with later, more sophisticated construction techniques and, crucially, sufficiently dry, well-preserved archaeological sites that direct physical examples actually start surviving in the archaeological record in any meaningful quantity, meaning our physical evidence timeline for footwear specifically tends to significantly lag behind the actual point when this basic protective technology likely first emerged. It's worth connecting this footwear timeline to a related piece of research already touched on regarding clothing more broadly, since the two technologies likely developed along a somewhat similar, overlapping timeline and using similar underlying archaeological detective methods. Just as researchers have used genetic analysis of body lice, which can only survive in clothing, to estimate roughly when humans first began wearing clothing regularly, footwear likely emerged around a broadly comparable period in human history, driven by the same underlying biological reality already discussed regarding humans losing most of their protective body hair and needing some kind of artificial substitute to survive in colder, harsher environments. Feet specifically would have represented one of the most exposed, vulnerable parts of the body precisely because they're in constant direct ground contact, meaning foot protection specifically may well have emerged as an urgent, practical priority even before more general body clothing became fully established as a consistent, widespread practice across a given population. Let's talk about footwear specialization for different activities too, because this represents an interesting, often overlooked dimension of how footwear technology likely developed and diversified over time, once the basic underlying concept had already become established. Just as modern footwear includes distinct designs for running, hiking, formal occasions, and various other specific purposes, there's reasonable archaeological and anthropological evidence suggesting early and traditional human societies also developed at least some degree of specialized, purpose-specific footwear. Distinct designs for hunting versus everyday wear, for example, or specific footwear modifications suited to particular seasonal conditions like deep snow or extended wet terrain. Some traditional Arctic and subarctic cultures developed remarkably sophisticated footwear specifically engineered for extreme cold and deep snow conditions, incorporating multiple layers of different materials, each serving a distinct functional purpose: insulation, moisture resistance, structural support, reflecting a level of specialized design sophistication considerably beyond simple generic foot coverings. This detail is worth appreciating because it demonstrates that footwear development, much like clothing development more broadly, wasn't a single, static technology that simply appeared once and then remained essentially unchanged for tens of thousands of years afterward. It continued evolving, diversifying, and becoming increasingly specialized and sophisticated as human populations settled into different environments and developed increasingly refined activity-specific practical needs, a pattern of continuous refinement that, in a meaningful sense, directly connects ancient footwear development to the enormous variety of highly specialized modern footwear available today. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Let's talk about footwear and social status too, because this represents another interesting dimension worth exploring, connecting footwear technology to broader questions about status and identity signaling already discussed regarding clothing more generally. In various ancient and historical societies, the specific quality, material, and craftsmanship of a person's footwear frequently served as a visible marker of social status and wealth, similar to how clothing more broadly often functioned as a status signal beyond its purely practical protective function. Finely crafted leather footwear, sometimes decorated or dyed using techniques requiring considerable additional skill and resources, would have been considerably more accessible to wealthier, higher status individuals within a given society, while simpler, more basic footwear, or in some cases no footwear at all, particularly in certain climates where footwear wasn't an urgent survival necessity, may have been more common among lower status individuals within the same society. This pattern of footwear functioning simultaneously as both practical protection and social signal echoes a broader theme that shows up constantly throughout the study of early human material culture and technology more generally. Almost as soon as humans developed a functional solution to a practical problem, that solution frequently and rapidly picked up additional layers of social and cultural meaning, extending well beyond its original, purely practical function. A pattern that shows up again and again across an enormous range of different early human technologies and inventions. Let's talk about a specific, well-preserved ancient example worth mentioning directly, involving footwear discovered alongside a remarkably well-preserved ancient human body found frozen in ice in the Alps, dated to roughly 5,000 years old. This particular individual's footwear, carefully examined by researchers studying the entire preserved body and its associated equipment in extraordinary detail, showed sophisticated multi-layer construction, incorporating different materials specifically selected for insulation and structural support, along with evidence of the footwear having been actively repaired and maintained during its use, suggesting these particular shoes represented a valuable, carefully maintained piece of practical equipment rather than something casually discarded and easily replaced. This specific discovery offers a remarkably detailed, tangible window into ancient footwear practice, revealing not just the basic construction technique involved, but also something meaningful about how this particular individual valued and actively maintained their footwear over time, treating it as durable, important, practical equipment worth investing ongoing effort and skill into repairing and preserving, rather than as some kind of quick, disposable, easily replaced item. It's a small but remarkably illuminating detail, suggesting a level of practical investment and care around footwear considerably closer to how many people relate to a valued, well-maintained piece of equipment today than to any kind of casual, throwaway attitude toward this specific technology. Let's talk briefly about footwear and disease or injury prevention too, because this connects directly back to the original survival motivation already discussed at the start of this whole topic. Beyond simply preventing acute injuries like cuts and punctures, reliable footwear likely also helped prevent certain parasitic infections that can enter the body directly through the skin of bare feet, particularly relevant in warmer, more humid environments with higher concentrations of soil-based parasites. While early, humans obviously had no theoretical understanding of parasites or infection transmission mechanisms. The simple, practical observation that people who kept their feet consistently covered seemed to experience fewer of certain specific health problems compared to those who went barefoot regularly would have provided a completely sufficient, practical incentive to continue and refine footwear use, entirely independent of any deeper scientific understanding of exactly why that practical benefit existed in the first place. Let's talk about geography and environmental variation next, because footwear likely didn't develop as a single, uniform technology invented once and then spreading uniformly everywhere. Different environments would have created very different levels of urgency and very different specific design requirements for early footwear. Populations moving into colder northern regions would have faced urgent pressure to develop footwear specifically capable of providing serious insulation against frostbite and extreme cold, likely driving the development of thicker, more fully enclosed footwear designs using fur and heavier hide materials. Populations in hot, arid, rocky terrain would have faced a different, though equally serious, set of pressures, primarily focused on protecting feet from sharp rocks and scorching hot ground surfaces, likely favoring lighter, more open sandal-style designs that still provided adequate sole protection while allowing better airflow and heat dissipation compared to a heavier, fully enclosed design. This pattern of environmentally driven design variation connects to a broader theme that shows up constantly throughout the study of early human technology and adaptation more generally. Rather than one single, universally optimal solution spreading uniformly everywhere, different populations independently developed different specific solutions, each one well suited to the particular environmental pressures and challenges of their own specific region, using whatever locally available materials happened to be most practical and abundant in that particular area. Let's talk about the specific materials early humans likely used for footwear construction, because this also varied considerably depending on what was locally available in any given region. Animal hide and fur were probably among the most common and versatile materials used across a wide range of different early human populations. thorns, given how widely available animal products already were as a byproduct of hunting activity conducted primarily for food. Plant fiber, including various forms of woven grass, bark, and other fibrous plant material, offered another readily available option, particularly well suited to warmer climates or regions with less reliable access to animal hide and considerably easier to work with using relatively simple tools compared to processing and shaping animal hide into a wearable form. The specific construction techniques required to turn these raw materials into functional, wearable footwear also represented a genuine technical skill in their own right, connecting directly to broader questions already explored regarding how early humans developed clothing more generally. Successfully turning a raw hide into a durable, properly fitted piece of footwear required understanding how to treat and prepare the material to prevent it from stiffening, cracking, or rotting, along with developing effective techniques for cutting, shaping, and securing the material onto the foot in a way that would actually stay in place and provide reliable protection during active movement, rather than simply falling apart or slipping off after a short period of use. Let's talk about a particularly interesting piece of research worth mentioning specifically, involving one of the oldest directly preserved leather shoes ever discovered, found in a cave in Armenia, and dated to roughly 5,500 years old. This particular shoe, remarkably well preserved due to the specific dry, stable conditions inside the cave where it was found, offers researchers an unusually detailed, direct look at fairly sophisticated ancient shoemaking technique, including evidence of careful shaping specifically fitted to the wearer's foot, and construction methods considerably more advanced than the simple, wrapped hide approach likely used during the very earliest periods of footwear development discussed earlier. This specific discovery is worth appreciating because it demonstrates just how much footwear technology had already advanced by this particular point in history, several thousand years into the broader story of human footwear development, showing clear evidence of deliberate, skilled craftsmanship well beyond the most basic, minimal, protective wrapping that likely characterized the earliest stages of this technology many thousands of years earlier. It offers a valuable, tangible snapshot of one specific point along what was clearly a long, gradual, continuously evolving technological development process, rather than representing the actual starting point of footwear technology itself. Let's talk about footwear and long-distance travel too, because this connects directly to broader questions already explored regarding how early humans managed to migrate across such enormous distances and such varied environments across the entire globe. Reliable, effective footwear would have been an important practical enabler for this kind of extensive migration, particularly into colder regions or across especially rough, challenging terrain, allowing early human populations to travel further, more safely, and more comfortably than would have been realistically possible relying purely on bare feet, especially once human migration began pushing into seriously harsh environments like Arctic tundra or extended Rocky Mountain terrain where unprotected feet would have faced serious, potentially disabling injury within a remarkably short period of sustained exposure. Let's talk about surviving traditional footwear practices among various indigenous and traditional cultures around the world today, because these living traditions offer researchers valuable additional insight beyond purely archaeological evidence, since they represent continuous, actively practiced knowledge passed down across many generations rather than something reconstructed purely from ancient physical remains. Traditional footwear designs still actively used today by various indigenous Arctic communities, certain desert-dwelling populations, and numerous other traditional cultures around the world often reflect an extraordinarily refined, deeply practical understanding of local environmental conditions, sometimes incorporating design principles that modern outdoor and performance footwear companies have only relatively recently begun to properly study, and in some cases directly incorporate into contemporary commercial product design. This connection between ancient traditional footwear knowledge and cutting-edge modern design is worth appreciating because it demonstrates that the accumulated practical wisdom developed by early and traditional societies wasn't simply a primitive stepping stone eventually rendered obsolete by modern technology. In plenty of specific cases, that accumulated traditional knowledge continues offering seriously valuable, practically applicable insight even within a thoroughly modern, technologically sophisticated context. It's worth acknowledging honestly before wrapping up that significant uncertainty remains throughout this entire topic, and that's worth stating plainly rather than glossing over. Given how little direct physical evidence has survived from the earliest periods of footwear use, researchers are working with an inherently incomplete picture, piecing together the most plausible overall narrative from indirect skeletal evidence, rare surviving physical examples from later periods, and reasonable inference based on what's already understood about early human technology and environmental adaptation more broadly. Future archaeological discoveries, along with continued refinement of skeletal analysis techniques, will likely continue to sharpen and, in some cases, meaningfully revise the current understanding of exactly when, where, and how this fundamental piece of human technology first emerged. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together, because the full story of how early humans first created shoes turns out to be considerably richer and more layered than a simple, single moment of invention could ever fully capture. Footwear likely emerged gradually out of genuine practical necessity as early humans faced the constant physical risks of exposed, unprotected feet across an enormous range of challenging environments and terrain types. The earliest footwear was almost certainly simple, made from readily available organic materials like hide, fur, or plant fiber, using minimal specialized construction technique, and it left behind frustratingly little direct physical evidence for modern researchers to examine, requiring clever, indirect methods like skeletal analysis to even estimate roughly when this technology first emerged in the first place. Over time, footwear construction techniques grew increasingly sophisticated, developing independently across different regions in response to each specific area's own particular environmental pressures and locally available materials, eventually producing the kind of detailed, skillfully constructed footwear evidenced by rare, well-preserved archaeological examples like the ancient Armenian shoe discussed earlier. So the next time you slip on a pair of shoes without a second thought, it's worth remembering that you're using a piece of technology with remarkably deep roots in human history, one that likely played a meaningful, practical role in allowing our species to successfully migrate into and survive within some of the most physically challenging environments on the entire planet. What feels like the most basic, unremarkable part of getting dressed in the morning actually represents tens of thousands of years of accumulated practical problem solving, refined gradually across countless generations of early humans working out through direct trial and error exactly how to keep their most constantly vulnerable body parts safely protected against an enormous range of environmental hazards. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. If something as basic and universal as shoes required this much accumulated practical ingenuity, environmental adaptation, and gradual technical refinement to develop, what other completely ordinary everyday objects sitting quietly around you right now might be carrying a similarly deep, similarly overlooked history of ancient human problem solving behind their current, unremarkable everyday form?